I analyzed the methodology of transdisciplinarity. Can you stop this sound? Of transdisciplinarity expressed in terms of three postulates. The first postulate is the following: there are in nature and in our knowledge of nature different levels of reality and correspondingly different level of perception. Second postulate: the passage from one level of reality to another is ensured by the logic of the included middle. Third postulate: the structure of the totality of levels of reality, of perception, is of a complex nature. Every level is what it is because all levels exist at the same time. The last year, I described the historical basis of these three postulates. The first two get their experimental evidence from quantum mechanics, quantum physics, while the last one has its source not only in quantum physics, but also in a variety of other exact and human sciences. It is interesting to note that the three postulates of transdisciplinarity are the equivalent of the three postulates of modern physics, as formulated by Galileo Galilei. I recall you the three postulates of Galileo Galilei, which govern even today in our scientific thinking. First, there are universal laws of a mathematical structure. Second postulate: these laws could be discovered by scientific experiment. Third postulate: such experiments could be perfectly replicated. So, the universality concerns the physical laws in the case of modern science and the levels of reality in the case of transdisciplinarity. However, the language is different. Mathematics in the case of modern science, and the new language of symbolic nature in the case of transdisciplinarity. The physical laws are discovered by scientific experiments concerning the object only, while the levels of reality are discovered through experiments involving both the subject and the object. The logic of modern science is mainly binary, while the logic of transdisciplinarity is ternary. Replicability applies in both cases. It is important to note that one can assume the validity of the three postulates of transdisciplinarity independently of their historical roots in some branches of modern science. In other words, transdisciplinarity doesn't rest on a transfer from modern science. This would be a wrong epistemological and philosophical procedure. Modern science, via its most general aspects, allowed us to identify the three postulates of transdisciplinarity, but once they are formulated, they have a much wider validity than in modern science itself. This is precisely the point of view adopted in this lecture when trying to analyze how the postulates of transdisciplinarity could lead us to a methodological foundation of transcultural and transreligious studies. A last point before we begin. The present study is a work in progress, exposed for the first time here. at the Centrum's meeting with the aim of stimulating debates and research. We will be therefore grateful for all critical remarks concerning our ideas. Now, let me recall some aspects, especially for the people who were not at the first meeting, concerning the transdisciplinary approach of nature and knowledge. The transdisciplinary approach all the symmetries. Good. It hurts. 4 times. Too sharp again. Okay. The transdisciplinary approach of nature knowledge can be described through the diagram exposed here. You see in the last row till the end of the paper? Yes? In the left part, they are symbolically drawn the levels of reality denoted here by NR, just indexes, NR minus N, NR minus 2, minus 1, 0, 1, 2, N is a way of indexing. And this index N can be finite or infinite. Here, the meaning we give to the word reality is pragmatic and ontological at the same time. By reality, with a capital R, just to distinguish from the other one, we intend first of all to designate that which resists our experiences, representations, descriptions, images, and even mathematical formulations. Insofar nature participates in the being of the world, one must give an ontological dimension also to the concept of reality. Reality is not merely a social construction, the consensus of a collectivity, or some intersubjective agreement. It has also a transsubjective dimension. For example, experimental data can ruin the most beautiful theory, scientific theory. Of course, this point which I'll try to stress for eliminating misunderstandings, one has to distinguish the word real from the word reality. Real designates that what it is, while reality is connected to resistance in our human experience. The real is by definition veiled forever, while the reality is accessible through our knowledge. By level of reality, a notion which I first introduced in 1982 and developed later in many other papers, I designate an ensemble of systems which are invariant under certain laws. For example, quantum entities are subordinate to quantum laws, which depart radically from the laws of the physical world, classical world. This is to say that two levels of reality are different if, while passing from one to the other, sorry, there is a break. So we say that we pass from one level to the other, designate here by these broken lines. This will designate levels of reality, symbolically. I'll go slowly through all these diagrams, 2 hours. Only one diagram. Okay, we go from one to the other if there is a break in the fundamental laws and fundamental concepts, like causality. We don't say they are different just because there are different details or different regularities or different phenomenological kind of differences. These are called in a different way. These are called levels of organization. So we have to distinguish levels of reality from levels of organization as they have been defined in systemic approaches. Level of organization do not presuppose a break. They are just rearranging of the systems conforming to the same general laws. So different levels of organizations, for example, to this level of reality, I can have 100 levels of organization which are associated with them. That will be important to discuss about disciplines and so on. So, for example, Marxist economy and classical physics belong to one and the same level of reality, but they are different levels of organization. Now, the point is that the emergence of at least, it's not necessary, I think it's okay, thank you. The emergence of at least 3 different levels of reality, 3. In the study of natural systems, the macrophysical level, the microphysical level, and the cyberspace-time is a major event in the history of knowledge and is under our eyes. At least the third one, the cyberspace-time. It can lead us to reconsider our individual and social lives, to give a new interpretation to old knowledge, to explore the knowledge of ourselves in a different way, here and now. The existence of different levels of reality have been affirmed by different traditions and civilizations. But this affirmation was founded either on religious dogma or on the exploration of the interior universe only. The new thing is a correspondence between external universe and internal universe. That's the new thing. In our century, in an effort to question the foundation of science, Edmund Husserl and other scholars have detected the existence of different levels of perception by the subject observer of reality. But these thinkers have been marginalized by academic philosophers and misunderstood by physicists, which each area being trapped in its respective specialization. In fact, these new thinkers were pioneers in the exploration of a multidimensional and multi-referential reality in which the human being is able to recover his place and his verticality. I have also, there are some physicists in the audience, perhaps they will recognize what I'm speaking about. The view I'm expressing here is really conformed to the founders of quantum mechanics, Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, and Niels Bohr. In fact, Werner Heisenberg came very near in his philosophical writings to the concept of level of reality. In his famous manuscript of the year 1942, which was published in German only in 1984 and translated in French just last year, I don't know about translation in English, Heisenberg, who knew well Husserl, introduced the idea of 3 regions of reality. 3, able to give access to the concept of reality itself. The first region is that of classical physics, the second of quantum physics, biology, and psychic phenomena, and the third, that of religious, philosophical, and artistic experiences. It's very interesting, the hierarchy which Heisenberg introduced. This classification has a subtle ground. I will come back to that main point. The subtle ground is the closer and closer connectiveness between the subject and the object. The transdisciplinary viewpoint allows us to consider a multidimensional reality structured by multiple levels, replacing the single level, one-dimensional reality of classical thought, which, alas, is still dominating in our days. According to the transdisciplinary approach, reality is structured via a certain number of levels. And the considerations which follow do not depend if they are finite or infinite. In other words, if this small index n is finite or infinite. Can be finite, can be infinite. To understand, for the people who have no knowledge of elementary mathematics, but even I think everybody has to have knowledge of elementary mathematics. If you take a segment like that between my figures here, how many points are between in this segment? How many points? Infinite. So in fact you can have a finite distance but you have infinite number of levels. In other words, you can have a finite distance here and have finite or infinite number of levels in between. So it's not the question of infinite extension. Okay. Now let me just, for clarity, but that's not important, to assume that n is infinite here. So, two adjacent levels, say here in the drawing, nr0 and nr1, are connected by the logic of included middle. I spoke last year about that. A new logic as compared with classical logic. Now, let's recall for the people who were not last year. What is classical logic? It's logic, our logic, in fact, usual logic, everyday logic, which is founded on three axioms. First, the axiom of identity, A is A. Second, the axiom of non-contradiction, A is not non-A. And the axiom of excluded middle. There exists no third term, T, capital T, T from the third, which is at the same time A and non-A. Now, as I explained the last year, one immediately arrives at the conclusion that the pairs of contradictory advanced by quantum physics are mutually exclusive, because one cannot assert the validity. One cannot affirm the validity of an assertion, a given assertion, and of opposite assertion at the same time, A and non-A. So of course one can. If one is mad, we have a problem of mind, or we allow a kind of delirium, why not? Is possible. But in rational language, the principle of non-contradiction is something elementary which has to be respected. Otherwise, anything can be said. Now, quantum physics brings the idea that we have to assert two different things. How that can be possible? So, there were big discussions at the beginning of the century, 19th century, and so one began to speak about quantum logics. Now, quantum logics generally modify the second axiom of the classical logic, the axiom of non-contradiction, keeping the non-contradiction, but with different values. Instead of having two, having 3, 4, 5 multi-valued logics. History will credit the French philosopher of Romanian origin, Stéphane Lupascu, born in 1900 and died in 1988, with having shown that the logic of the included middle is a true logic, formalizable and formalized. Multivalent with 3 values, A, non-A, and T, which are symbolically drawn in this figure. A, non-A, T, A, non-A, T, and so on. Or downstairs, A, non-A, T, A, non-A, T, and so on. Now, of course, there is a mystery there which is easily clarified if one introduces the levels of reality. The mystery is the following: how can say a thing at the opposite at the same time without being slightly disturbed mentally? The answer is very simple, in fact. If there are levels of reality, if there are levels of reality, one can have A and non-A at the same time and still respecting the logic, the axiom of non-contradiction, but the term, the third term, which mediates the conciliation between the two opposites, have to be on a different level of reality. So, for people here in the audience, I know that there are, see, Professor Wasserstrom and others who are familiar with coincidentia oppositorum from the Middle Age. The coincidentia oppositorum is not the included third, because coincidentia oppositorum doesn't postulate in general a third term. They come very near. Jung and other people who used after that, and Eliade, okay, they came very near, but they didn't formulate the idea of levels of reality, so the included third. So it's not the same thing. Now, so it's very easy to understand, and I will come back to this figure by recalling a figure I showed last year, which is that basic building block of the previous figure. If we represent the terms of the new logic, A, non-A, and T, and the dynamics associated with that by a triangle in which two of the terms, opposite terms, are one level of reality, the third on a different level of reality. The included middle here appears really like an included third. The technical word in English is somewhat bad, misleading, because it said included middle. It's not a middle, it's a third in fact, but I have to keep the technical language of logics in order to not to invent something new as words. So if one remains at one level of reality, everything appears to be contradictory. A, non-A, A, non-A. Is our everyday life is full of contradictories. Now, conciliation, real conciliation, can appear only if there are different levels of reality. So it's the projection, in fact, of the T state onto a single level of reality which produces this kind of illusion. It's a kind of illusion of mutually contradictory, mutually exclusive, antagonistic pairs. So a level of reality by itself is self-destructive if it's completely separate from the other levels of reality. Now, let me come back to the previous figure. So the T1 state, say this one, T1, present on the level, say, NR1, is connected with a pair of contradictories, A0, non-A0, which are situated on an immediately contiguous level, NR0. Okay. So T1 state allows the unification of contradictories A0 and non-A0, but I repeat, because that's the main point, the unification has to occur on a different level of reality. So the axiom of non-contradiction is respected. That's the main point. The axiom of non-contradiction is always respected. So there is now certainly coherence of among different levels of reality. We can have 2, 3, and time, historical time, will certainly discover other levels of reality. That's our destiny. Now, the coherence can be described via an iterative process, which can be defined through the following stages. First stage, A pair of contradictories, say A0, non-A0, is unified by a T1 state situated at immediately neighbor and at one level. Second state, in its turn, this T1 state separates with the historical time. Again, we explore reality, universe, knowledge, ourselves. We discover other contradictories. That's normal with the more modern instruments of investigation, with the accumulation of knowledge. So this T1 state will be connected with a couple of contradictories on the same level of reality. This new couple of contradictory, third stage, will be unified by a T2 state, say, situated at an R2 level of reality, and so on, ad infinitum, till the moment we exhaust all possible levels of reality. In other words, the action on the logic on the included middle induces an open structure. This is the key word here, open structure of the unity of levels of reality. Open, why? Because this unification never stops. At a given moment stops, of course, but with the passage of time, never stops. Open unity. So this structure means, showed very schematically here, that there is impossible to get a theory of knowledge which is complete, self-enclosed. Now, that's very important. I'm speaking in what seems to be an abstract manner here. But in fact, you can have in mind all the theories of dictators, for example, which crossed the 20th century, Nazis, communists, and so on. They have in mind, in fact, a complete theory. They spoke about scientific socialism, for example, scientific. This means a complete theory. It means that everything which is known and will be known will be there, is there forever. There is the same temptation, I would say, in some spiritual kind of teachings, in which some gurus say, I know everything. Well, I know everything, this means contradiction with Gödel's theorem. Sorry. And it's not a failure. That's very important. This fact that the theory is not complete, it's not a failure, it's something very big, in fact. This means that is really a unity of the known, where known participates all the time at the knowledge. So the elimination of the contradiction, that's another subtle point about the non-contradiction. The elimination of non-contradiction is only temporary. Non-contradiction is not violated at a given time, but when time passes, we have to introduce a new kind of unification to respect even better the non-contradiction. In other words, there's a very subtle point here about non-contradiction. Non-contradiction is in fact respected when historical times goes on, more and more and more. But knowledge is forever open. Now, if you look now, I'm speaking now, right? I begin to speak only about this part, the left part. And for the moment, I looked only here till here, this final distance. So, in the sphere of levels of reality per se, that what it is above is like what is below. But what is below is not like what is above. What I mean by that? Degrees of materiality. Every level of reality, resistance, is connected with the degree of materiality. The degree of materiality becomes finer and finer, subtle, subtler and subtler. Every level of reality which is subtler or subtle materiality penetrates say, the macro-physical level penetrates the quantum level. The quantum level penetrates the macro-physical level, but the inverse is not true. So what is above is like what is below, but what is below is not what is above if you have only this region here. Suppose that you erase everything which is at the left, the loops and so on, and you look only here. Now, the words I am using, high and low, has nothing to do with some moral connotation, spatial and so on. It's just topological. And it's connected with the flow of information. Now, let's go a little bit further and look for these loops here. 3 loops. 3, why 3? Because just is a ternary kind of description, so it's normal to take 3 loops. 3 for the coherence. I don't say unity. I say coherence of the word. What I mean by coherence? What I mean by coherence is that this word, like it is here, stays solid in some sense. From the physics point of view, here can be an explosion, atomic explosion at any moment. Why is not? Because there is coherence. Coherence between what? Between levels. Between infinitely small, infinitely big, infinitely short, infinitely long, and so on. But between the universe and what is downstairs, the quantum level. We are in between. So the arrows are very important here because these arrows describe the orientation, the transmission of flux of information in such a way that every level informs the other level. And what a level is because all the others exist at the same time. Because if they are not at the same time, the flux will be cut of information. We recover Jacob Böhme in a more modern language. But it's the idea of Jacob Böhme, in fact. It's going back to 16th century. Okay. Now, this open structure, this means never complete. This open structure is in agreement with one of the most important scientific results of the 20th century concerning arithmetics, the theorem of Kurt-Gödel, which states that a sufficiently rich system of axioms inevitably leads to results which are either indecisive or contradictory. They are indecisive if the system is open. They are contradictory if the system is closed. It's very important. This means that if you think in your life or in anything that starting from some assertions you arrive at truth, at some moment you arrive at a contradiction. You have to. Or it's something you cannot say. It's right, it's wrong. That is true in arithmetics, and it's true in any mathematics which contain arithmetics. Of course, it's not true in general. There is not a theorem of Gödel for human sciences. But human sciences have even higher complexity than mathematical theories. So the Gödelian structure associated with the logic of included middle implies that it is impossible to construct a complete theory for describing the passage from one level to the other, and a fortiori for describing the unity of the levels of reality. If this unity exists, it has to be open unity. So now we were here, we begin to describe the loops. So we arrive now in this region here. We go slowly from the left to the right. Please. You count the time for the end, yeah. About? No, I say Gödel. You want Hegel? Yeah. Yeah, okay. It's a very nice comment. It's a very nice comment. I can explain two words. Yeah. I will repeat the question. The question was about Hegel. If Hegel cannot be primitive. At the end, perhaps. At the end. Keep the question at the end because it's a nice question. Yes. So let's go. So we said that there is a coherence. Now, if the coherence, this coherence, is limited at this highest level or lowest level, has to stop. So this means the word itself is not coherent. We have, rationally speaking, rational, I underline the word rational, to postulate, to assert that in order that this visible coherence we have in the universe to continue, to be there, it has to go through a zone where simply there are no levels of reality. There is no resistance. Why is no resistance? If our sense organs are limited. I think everybody here in the room, and even any philosopher and any thinker will agree, in fact, that our knowledge by our body, by our mind, is limited. Our sense organs are limited, our brain is limited, our instruments of nature which prolong our sense organs are limited. We are not gods, in spite of some assertion. We are not gods. So, if we accept this limitation, this means that we have to assert that this coherence has to go through a zone of non-resistance. Non-resistance to our descriptions, representations, formalizations, even mathematical formalizations. This zone of non-resistance corresponds to the veil, quoted yesterday by my friend Michel Randon, which Bernard d'Espagnat referred to the veil of the real. Veil of the real. Veil, les voiles, réel voilé. So, this means that we arrive at a unification of the highest level and lowest levels, but this unification has to be done through a zone of non-resistance. Now, as in the old sayings, we can say that what is low is the same as what is high, the very old Hermetic assertion. So, the correspondence between high and low has to be established by a zone of non-resistance here. And this zone, I repeat, there are no levels of reality, by definition. And we have to choose a word. We have not many words in our language, be it English or Portuguese or French or any language, which are not prostituted. Every word is prostituted. But some are less prostituted than others. So I had to choose one. I chose the word sacred. I think that this zone is really corresponding to what the word sacred describes. In the sense, first, as a definition, sacred, meaning that which does not submit to any rationalization. Doesn't mean that it's not rational, means that refuses any kind of rationalization, any kind of discourse, any kind of description, except the assertion that is there. Now, it is also important to note something which is not a detail. These loops of coherence which has to go through the zone of non-resistance, if you look here, go also in between the levels of reality. That's very important. In other words, this zone of non-resistance is refound between the levels of reality. Has to be a zone there which is discontinuous, real discontinuity. There's nothing in between, except this non-resistance. So, in other words, this sacred, in some sense, this non-resistant thing permeates every level of reality. So, in other words, I think we arrived at a quite dramatic point in some sense, if we understand what is about the story. We have arrived in a rational way to try to establish a link between two opposites, real and reality. The real thing, which by definition refuses any kind of discourse and realization and so on, and reality, which is due to resistance. Now, the transdisciplinary approach arrives to make a connection between real and reality. I would say that is even one of the main features of transdisciplinary, between real and reality. So, the unity of the levels of reality and its complementary zone of non-resistance, we can call it the object, to take the words of modern metaphysics. The object, transdisciplinary object, because it's in the external world. It's resistant. For the moment we are here, in the external world. And immediately, from these simple considerations, something amusing results, interesting, amusing as a consequence, is a new principle of relativity. In the following meaning, no level, this new principle of relativity is the following: no level of reality constitutes a privileged place from which one is able to understand all other levels of reality. This is inherent in this description. This is why I am keeping repeating the level is what it is, because all the others exist at the same time. So this principle of relativity, which is not relativism, has nothing to do with what is now very fashionable, the relativism kind of approach. Because here is an orientation. It's not everything which goes, right? And this is important because this principle of reality, this principle of relativity is what originates a new perspective in other fields, that academic disciplines. I'll come just now to the subject in a few seconds. So, the different levels, here now we can go slightly faster on the right part, which is in fact the part which concerns art. The different levels of reality are accessible because there are levels of perception in ourselves, in the observer, in the subject. And this is denoted here by NP. Sorry for the N, yeah. I kept it from French. I realized just now. Niveau de perception, level of perception. And this has to be in correspondence, one-to-one correspondence, between level of perception and levels of reality. So perception itself has level. For people who are studying, I think, seriously, the artistic kind of history and evolution and creation, or if they are artists, they know very well from their own experience that they are level. Now, what we said here can be repeated here. We cannot assert the region of levels of perception. Cannot be a complete description also here. And like in the case of levels of reality, this region of levels of perception have to be continued through a zone of non-resistance. In the zone of what we can call the subject, the transdisciplinary subject. So in this zone of non-resistance, there are no levels of perception. There's nobody there, like us. Perhaps not like us can be, but I mean, like us, human beings, limited human beings, there are no levels of perception. Now, if the subject can communicate with the object, these loops of coherence on the right and on the left have to meet somewhere in order to transmit the information. Information of what? Information here in the level of reality region, and what we can call, without being afraid, consciousness. Levels of consciousness in the right part of the levels of perception. There's a flux of information here, flux of consciousness. If they are not connected, there's no coherence. So what is described here by the point X must be at least one point, can be many, but at least one of communication between the subject and the object. So, in that perspective, knowledge is neither exterior nor interior. It's both, and exterior and interior. And there is a unification of the subject and object through a third term, call it the interaction term, with the main feature that this third term here cannot be reduced to the left part or to the right part, to the subject or to the object. There are always three in knowledge, not two. So, this point X here has an interesting meaning if we try to read it on the diagram. In some sense, the point X is the source of all reality and all perception. Everything is concentrated there in the diagram. Flux of consciousness, flux of information, this meeting point. So, this ternary partition, object, subject, interaction, this I have to stress, is radically different from the binary partition, subject-object, which defines modern metaphysics. That's a loose term, metaphysics, because everybody uses like he wants. But in academia, you have to respect the words like they are defined in academia. And in academia, metaphysics means subject-object, the modern metaphysics. So the transdisciplinary approach is in a deep rupture with the modern metaphysics. And it's precisely thanks to this rupture that transdisciplinarity is able to offer a methodological foundation of trans-culture and trans-religion, as I will try to argue in the following. But before going to that, I will stress something historical in two words, but can take books, entire books and conferences to understand and describe that. The subject-object problem was central for the founding fathers of quantum mechanics. Pauli, Heisenberg, Bohr, as Husserl, Heidegger. I'll come back to the figures in 1 second. No, okay. for the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, Pauli, Heisenberg, Bohr, as Husserl, Heidegger, or Cassirer, refuted the basic axiom of modern metaphysics, the clear-cut distinction between subject and object, which forms, one can put really one name on that, but as physicist, certainly Galileo Galilei introduced this cut. So all our considerations here will be described in this new kind of partition, subject-object interaction. Now, I can come after these preliminaries, just preliminaries, to the notion of academic disciplines, cultures, and religion. Now, academic disciplines are studying fragments of levels of reality, even not one level. The academic discipline never explores the level of reality, just fragments, by definition. Put your name, psychology, mathematics, physics, chemistry, and so on, a fragment of reality, a level. And even more important, these academic disciplines are concerned only with the zone of the subject, object. Again, by definition, I mean in our time, not 1,000 years ago. So, academic disciplines concerned with this region of the object and with fragments of levels of reality. So, they are founded, consciously or not, on a model, which is the mechanistic model of physics. Is the classical mechanics which founded the disciplinary point of view, which was put in movement in universities beginning with 12th century, with the first university. So the disciplinary academic disciplines are corresponding to, by definition, is what we can call an in vitro knowledge. What means in vitro? We cut reality, a fragment of reality. We put it under a glass, under laboratory. And studying this fragment, the postulate of a discipline is that we can find laws, we can find reality, we can find even for some disciplines, it says that we can find anything. It's not by accident that in physics we speak about the theory of everything. It's not just a joke. Unified theory. So the postulate, you take a fragment, an in vitro, from the external world, the world of the object, the left part of the diagram. They are obviously power-oriented, possessiveness, domination of nature, the world. They are putting in movement a given type of intelligence, which is the analytic intelligence of the human being. They are governed by binary logic, and by definition, they are supposed to be neutral. What means neutral? Is independent of a system of values. If a professor at university begins to teach quantum mechanics with a system of values, he will be pushed out from the university. And I think he's right, because one has to respect the knowledge like it is. Now, if you compare what I'm just schematically saying here with the figure I showed before, you realize that all these features are in fact ad hoc features, ad hoc, artificial, and even illusory. Why? Because if the approach we are describing is right, this means that you can never cut totally the object from the subject. So that's like an idealization, like an approximation. The full knowledge is a new type of knowledge. I put here TK, transdisciplinary knowledge, initially. DK, disciplinary knowledge, which corresponds to an in vivo. We try to connect things, to do connection, links. Concerns not only the object by the correspondence between the object and the subject, correspondence between external world, internal world. We are concerned in this type of knowledge with understanding, not only knowledge, but understanding of knowledge. We are concerned with a new type of intelligence, which introduces value of knowledge to the body and value of knowledge for the feelings, not only for the analytic mind. Is oriented towards astonishment because surprise is from everywhere here. Astonishment oriented and sharing. It's not power oriented. So in that is an included middle kind of logic based knowledge, and by definition supposes inclusion of values. It's not neutral. The transdisciplinary knowledge is not scientific in that sense. It's not neutral. Now, what is important to realize, that I stressed last year, is that there is no opposition between the two. Transdisciplinary knowledge cannot exist without disciplinary knowledge, which is impossible. Has no nourishment, has no data. They are complementary, like two contradictors, in fact. They can be united. And what is important, that is not just to keep an honorability for academia, that I'm saying that, but both methodologies are founded on the scientific attitude. They are not scientific. The methodology of transdisciplinarity is not scientific, but the spirit is scientific. And probably what is much more general than science itself is the scientific attitude, the scientific spirit. This means checking everything, not believing in anybody, not believing in anything which is said, checking first. That's the big lesson of science. Check by yourself. So, the above consideration can explain the somewhat paradoxical statement I made. Don't be disturbed, but because I put now. The somewhat paradoxical statement I made that transdisciplinary knowledge is able to bring a new vision on academic disciplines, not only on academic disciplines, but also on cultures and religion. The statement looks paradoxical, how transdisciplinarity can speak about something which are not disciplines. Now we can understand, now with all this consideration, why. How we can understand, in a simple way, but this can be, take books also, to be described in detail. There is a crucial difference between academic disciplines and science and cultures and religion. What is the difference? The radical difference is that academic disciplines are situated here, on the level of the object. They are concerned with resistance, with levels, with neutrals, or everything we said before. While cultures and religions are not concerned with fragments of levels of reality only. They are concerned also, but not only. So with what are in fact concerned? If we forget about sophisticated kind of discussions about that, but at the main level. Well, they are connected in this framework with level of reality, levels of perception, and a fragment of the sacred. Is a section, a culture, a religion. looks like here in this diagram like a horizontal section. It's not here, it's in this region. Romanian culture, French culture, Brazilian culture, and so on. They have resistance. Just go and see. Brazil plus 500. It's incredible. I would like to propose myself to make guided tours at Brazil plus 500. Why? Because there I can give a living lecture for you in front of this exhibition and showing where are the levels of reality, where are the levels of perception, where is the second. It's extraordinary. It's the incarnation of what we are speaking here at this splendid exhibition, where you see, I will come back to see that I'm not speaking just in a sentimental way. Now, the resistance, what is this resistance implied by the level of reality, if we are trying to speak in a rational way? Well, this is a resistance connected with a given territory, geographical territory. Is a resistance connected where different well-defined culture appears or religion appears. Is connected with the historical events through which a given collectivity went through. Series of events which are different in different cultures. The trajectory, the history. And also with a different mixture of cultures, cultural and religion habits carried by the people who are crossing the big human territory. You go to this exhibition, you see how many cultures, cultural habits, religious habits are crossing Brazil. It's fabulous. And it's one culture. Okay. So if there's somebody which can obtain from me this job, I'll quit this NRS, go as a guide to make guided tours. Now, the resistance implied by the levels of perception in the cultures of religion are connected with what? What kind of resistance? Well, spiritual practices, cultural habits associated with a given theology, a given religious doctrine, a given ensemble of cultural personalities and their teaching through the historical time. What appears for me interesting in this description, there is something which is shared by all cultures and all religions, which is this zone on non-resistance of the sacred. Perhaps this fact could explain why there is an inextinguishable desire of universality, more or less hidden in any culture, in any religion, in spite of their claim of absolute specificity. The contemporary polemics about, for example, the status of an academic discipline like the history of religions and the violent debate around the life and the work of its founder, Mircea Eliade, are explained quite simply through this diagram. One demands at the history of religion two mutually contradictory exclusive conditions, mutually exclusive conditions. To be neutral, as the other academic disciplines, to be here, the left side of this diagram, and to study a non-neutral phenomenon, religions. In other words, one demands to the history of religion to belong exclusively to the left part of this figure, and at the same time to belong to the right part. That's impossible. Of course, impossible in the framework of the methodology and the logic of disciplinary knowledge. The only way, in my opinion, the only way out is to accept methodology and logic of transdisciplinary approach. The crucial problem is certainly, as foreseen by Eliade, the status of the sacred. So I will discuss a little bit just this now. The trans-religious attitude and the presence of the sacred. Wait. The problem of the sacred, understood as the presence of something of irreducible real in the world, is unavoidable for any rational approach to knowledge. One can deny, one can affirm the presence of the sacred in the world in ourselves, but in view of elaborating a coherent discourse of reality, one is always in fact obliged to refer to it in a negative and in a positive way. The sacred belongs to one of the acceptions of the word, that which connects. The sacred links, as indicated by one of the etymological roots of the word religion, religare, to bind together, again. But such an ability is not an attribute of just one religion. Nietzsche Eliade once stated in an interview, I quote him, "The sacred does not imply belief in God, on gods or spirits. It is the experience of a reality and the source of the consciousness of existing in the world." In other words, I finish the quotation, in other words, the sacred is first of all an experience. It is transmitted by a feeling, the religious feeling, of that which links being and things, and in consequence induces in the very depths of the human being an absolute respect for the others, to whom he is linked by their all sharing a common life on one and the same earth. The abolition of the sacred led to abomination of Auschwitz and to 25 million deaths under the Stalinist system, and the absolute respect for others has been replaced by the pseudo-sacralization of a race, of a new man, embodied by dictators elevated to the rank of divinities. Now, the origin of totalitarianism is found on the abolition of the sacred also, where it is the experience of the irreducible real. The sacred is actually, as stressed by Eliade, the essential element in the structure of consciousness, and not simply a stage in the history of consciousness, like the relativistic thinking would like to say. When this element is violated, disfigured, mutilated, history becomes criminal. In this context, the etymology of the word sacred is highly instructive. This word comes from the Latin sacer, which is to say, that which cannot be touched without soiling, but also that which cannot be touched without being so. In other words, sacer designates the guilty who are consecrated to the infernal gods. Historically, it's very known. At the same time, because of its Indo-European root sacred is linked to the sanctus holy. This double meaning of sacer, sacred and nevio, is the double meaning of the history itself. Is these stammering, contortions, contradictions that give sometimes the impression that history is a tale of a madman. It is precisely the notion of the sacred which is now violently criticized in academic circles. For example, Daniel Dubuisson, the French researcher, considers as heretical the position of Eliade. In a more subtle way, Antoine Ferrand considers the sacred as being just an assumption which has to submit to the Popperian criterion of refutation. For Ferrand, the sacred is just an historical phenomenon. It is not clear not at all clear that the Popperian criterion, which is already doubtful, even in exact sciences, has to be applied to a human science like history of religions. Certain historians of religions, obsessed by neutrality, objectivity, and refutation, seem to me to be in the position of the physicists of the 19th century. Much more open attitude is took, to my knowledge, by Brian Rennie in a well-documented book, Reconstructing Eliade. The hot subject of the sacred, which we discussed from our point of view here, will be soon discussed in a coming workshop organized by the International Association for the History of Religions. It is paradoxical and significant that the most desacralized period in history, this means our period, has generated, nevertheless, one of the most profound reflections on the question of the sacred outside the academic circle. The unavoidable problem of the sacred runs through the work of many diverse 20th century thinkers and authors, from masters of thinking to masters of living. And this transdisciplinary model of reality we are discussing here cuts a new light of the meaning of the sacred. What is this new light? In the most general terms, I come back to the figure. In most general terms, movement. What is movement here in this approach? Movement is crossing levels. Crossing levels of reality, crossing levels of perception. That gives the deepest meaning we can give to the notion of movement in general. Now, this coherent movement through levels of reality or levels of perception is associated simultaneously with two meanings, right? We can have an arrow like that, we can have an arrow like that. Two arrows. Cannot be three, it's just two arrows. In other words, we can have, in this topological meaning, an ascending movement, we can have a descending movement. Now, the zone of the absolute non-resistance, absolute to our representations, images, and so on, appears like the source of this double movement, descending, ascending. We can say that this zone is beyond the zone of the sacred, but a beyond which is nevertheless connected with the levels, incarnating the levels. So the zone of absolute resistance is the space, we can say, of trans-ascendance and trans-descendance. What means these words, new words I'm introducing here? Transcendence means here that this zone is bound up with the philosophical concept of transcendence, which comes from transcendere, to climb beyond. Transcendence, climb beyond. Here is a transcendence, transdescendence. Transdescendence is bound out with the old concept of immanence. So, we have no choice. We have to invent some new words or some new oxymorons. So we will say that this zone of non-resistance is at once immanent transcendence and transcendent immanence. We have to put contradictories together if we want not to invent new words. But these two terms are not adequate for designating the zone of non-resistance, because this zone cannot be reduced to the one or the other. So again, the word sacred is adopted here as a conciliation between this double movement of immanent transcendence and transcendent immanence. One way or another, different religions, as well agnostic, atheist currents, are defined in terms of the question of the sacred. So experience of the sacred appears is the source of a trans-religious attitude. What means trans-religious now? I introduced this new word. Trans-religious designates the opening of all religions to that which cuts through them, in the sense I described them as sections, horizontal sections, cuts through them and transcends them, go beyond them. The trans-religion, in other words, doesn't mean a unique religion in the terms of included middle kind of approach, but the open, transcendent unity of all religions. Sorry for this trivial comparison, but religions are like cookings. You can have Chinese cooking, French cooking, Romanian cooking. You can appreciate everyone cooking. The taste is the same, is good for the people who know to taste it. So it's not the question that is that you make a unique cooking will be horrible. We keep the French cooking, we keep the Chinese cooking, like they are. We even reinforce them, right? But must be something common which we call taste, to taste them. Now, sorry for this trivial kind of comparison, but it comes me because you are after digestion, just in the time of digestion. So I thought that it's not bad to speak about that. So, okay. So, it is the sacred which allows the unity to be effective, even if trans-religion, understood correctly, will be never formulates in terms of a theology. Is this trans-religion, this I quote religion after religion, the nice oxymoron which gives the title of the book of Professor Stephen Wasserstrom? I don't know. Perhaps he can answer. In any case, I was happy to find in his book the word trans-religious in a meaning near to the one adopted by myself. Transdisciplinarity is neither religious nor irreligious. It is trans-religious. It is the trans-religious attitude emerging from the lived transdisciplinarity which permits us to learn, to know, and appreciate specificity of religious and irreligious traditions which are foreign to us, to better perceive the common structures which found them, and to arrive at a trans-religious vision of the world. In other words, trans-religious attitude is not in contradiction with any religious tradition or with any agnostic or atheistic current, to the extent that these traditions and these currents recognize the presence of the sacred. In fact, the presence of the sacred is our trans-presence, we can say, trans-presence in the world. Of course, it was widespread, the trans-religious attitude will make all religious words impossible. Now, the concept of trans-religion, which I'm formulating here, is very near of what the great Arab poet Adonis calls in his very nice book, I quote exactly for the people who wants to read that, is in French. La prière et l'épée. La prière et l'épée, essai sur la culture arabe. So it's very near of what Adonis calls the mysticism of art. In fact, Adonis has to be present here as a keynote speaker. But, well, he regrets very much, but his health situation forbidden him to be here with us. So what Adonis calls the mysticism of art. What is mysticism of art? I recall Adonis. A movement towards the hidden face of reality, a living experience, a perpetual travel towards the heart of the world. I quote him. A unification of contradictories, he used the word. The infinity and the unknown as aspiration. Freedom from any philosophic or religious system. Spontaneous creation in a trans-rational state. In fact, all the work of Adonis has a trans-cultural and trans-religious nature, as shown by Michel Camus in a recent book. The trans-religious attitude is also very near of what the great Christian theologian and philosopher Raymond Panikkar calls the intra-religious dialogue, a dialogue which occurs in the heart of any human being, not outside, in the heart of any human being. The trans-religious attitude is not simply an utopian project, because it is engraved in the very depths of our being. Through the transcultural, which leads to the trans-religious, the war of cultures has no more reason to be. Now, I go to the question of the two cultures. At the beginning of human history, science and culture were not separated. They were animated by the same questions, those about the meaning of the universe and the meaning of life. In the Renaissance, the tie was not yet broken. As its name indicates, the first university was studying the universal. The universal was embodied in those who would make their stamp on the history of knowledge. Let's quote just Newton, the example of Newton, who was simultaneously a physicist, a theologian, and an alchemist. He was captivated by the Trinity, as by the geometry. And he spent more time in his alchemical laboratory than in elaboration of his Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. The germ of the split between science and meaning, between subject and object, was certainly present in the 17th century when the methodology of modern science was formulated, but it did not become full-blown until the 19th century. In our time, the split was consummated. Science and culture have nothing more in common, as strongly stressed, for example, by Steven Weinberg in his writing, Nobel Prize of Physics. This is why one speaks about science and culture. Science does not have access to the nobility of culture, and culture does not have access to prestige of science. One understands the indignant cries unleashed by the concept of two cultures, scientific and humanistic, introduced some decades ago by C.P. Snow, a novelist and scientist. Science is certainly a part of culture, but this scientific culture is completely separated from the humanistic culture. And with the scheme we developed here, we can understand fully what we are saying here. The two cultures are perceived like antagonists. Each word is hermetically shut on itself. In recent times, of course, there are signs of reconciliation between the two cultures. But, question, serious question for you transdisciplinary researchers. Is this reconciliation possible? It's not obvious. If we come back to our basic figure diagram, figure 1, the scientific culture is entirely situated here, on the left part of the object, while the humanistic culture crosses this diagram between the left and the right part. And this asymmetry between science and culture, read on this diagram, demonstrates the difficulty, I don't say the impossibility, but the difficulty of reconciliation. This, in other words, this reconciliation will occur only when will be a conversion, a true conversion of science towards the values and towards the sacred. This means when the scientific culture will become really a culture and not a simile-culture. Now, what means conversion? It's not a religious term I'm using here, but means conversion in the sense of first going through the conversion of scientists themselves. Science is not an abstract unity, it's connected with scientists. And this process is already visible. I cannot enter in detail here, but it's already visible all through the world. It's not only Fritjof Capra and so on. Now, a multitude of people now who try to think in the terms of the connection between science and culture, science and religion, and so on. Now, transdisciplinarity offers a methodological basis for the reconciliation of these artificially antagonistic cultures. And the encounter, the key point, I would say, which transdisciplinary methodology can offer is the notion of levels of representations. Now, the notion of levels of representations is closely connected with levels of reality, levels of perception. Images which correspond to a certain level of representation have a different quality. The word quality is very important here. Quality meaning in transdisciplinary approach, crossing of levels. From where can come quality, otherwise than crossing different levels. So, this means that a certain level of representation have a different quality than images associated with another level of representation. When two people discuss, they are using, without knowing, different levels of representation. So how hell they can understand each other? I don't know. Perhaps you know. So each level of representation appears like a word, apparently unsayable because of its relation to the images engendered by another level of representation. So this level of representation of the sensible world are therefore connected with a level of perception of the creator, the scientist, of the artist. A true artistic creation arises at the moment bridging several levels of perception at the same time, engendering what we can call a transperception. A new word, new concept, transperception. Transperception permits a global, non-differentiated understanding of totality of levels of perception. Now, this means, using these words, this terminology, that true scientific creation arises at the moment bridging several levels of representation at the same time, engendering what we can call a transrepresentation. Transperception and transrepresentations, two new and basic concepts, could explain the surprising similarities between moments of scientific and artistic creation, as brilliantly demonstrated in a book written in the 1950s by the great mathematician Jacques Hadamard concerning the imagination in mathematics. Now, let me close with some consideration about transcultural now. I spoke about the two cultures, now I'll speak about transculture. But when we try to contemplate the 20th century, this old century culture, is a feeling of, I don't know, which is disconcerting, paradoxical, and fascinating at the same time. Why? Because there are immense treasures of wisdom, knowledge, culture, accumulating, and still we kill each other on this earth. The question is why? What is true is that in a rational manner, these treasures of culture cannot be communicated. That's one point of difficulty. Cannot be translated from one culture to the other. It's impossible. In fact, impossible. In terms of our scheme here, it's even clear why. Because of this discontinuity. This continuity can be breached. There is no translation from one culture to the other. Except one which I try to discuss, because otherwise I will not discuss here. So, cultures, we can say, emerge from the silence between the words. And this silence cannot be translated. Now, no matter what their emotional weight, the words of everyday life are primarily addressed to the intellect. Why? Because we have to survive. But cultures emerge from totality of human beings in a particular geographic and historical area, all their feelings, hopes, beliefs, and questions. Now, we have, of course, prodigious advances in methods of transportation, communication, which brought about this mixture, intermingling of cultures. But this is chaotic. The proof is the incredible difficulties, at least in some countries like France, which are concomitant with the integration of different cultural minorities in various countries of the world. So how we can make the integration? In name of which language? What kind of Esperanto can be done for cultures? So it's a very paradoxical time, I say fascinating, because our time looks like open and closed at the same time. Everything is open, everything is there, everything is given, and nothing happens, almost nothing. Now, the fabulous advance, accelerating advance of technoscience has served only to deepen the abyss between cultures. So the 19th century hope for single culture, founded on the happiness brought about science, came a long time ago. So what we witnessed, a complete separation between science and culture, on one hand, and on the other, a cultural fragmentation within each and every culture. In fact, this fragmentation is felt in every culture. The disciplinary Big Bang has its equivalent in the Big Bang of cultural modes, founded on the lost memory of the sacred. Anything goes. So, one mode of thought is swept by another one with the increasing speed, very soon the speed of light. And in spite of this chaotic appearance, modernity leads to an approachment between cultures. A resurgence of the need to unite being with the world. Now, the potential for birth of a culture of hope, what we can call culture of hope, is precisely equivalent to the potential for self-destruction, which is engendered by the abyss of non-meaning. We have links, of course, which are made, multicultural links. which shows that the dialogue between different cultures is enriching. We have the intercultural dialogue, which is clearly assisted by the growth of transportation, communication, by economic globalization. And the discovery of badly known, unknown cultures makes, of course, unsuspected potentialities for our own culture. For example, the influence of African art to the appearance of Cubism is one famous example, historical example. In other words, the face of the other allows us to know better our own face. But what is important in the framework of our discussion here is that multicultural and intercultural by themselves do not assure the kind of communication between all cultures. The transcultural is needed. What designates the transcultural? The opening of all cultures to which cuts through them and transcends them. The same as for trans-religion. And the reality of the opening like that is proven by the example of famous research of a director like Peter Brook, and with company Centre National de Création Théâtrale. The actors are very different, of different nationalities, themselves involved in different cultures, and still these people of different nations can create Mahabharata, can create the Tempest, can create the Conference of the Birds, with an equal possibility of communication. And not to quote what happens here in this country, with the extraordinary performances in the theater of Ruth Escobar, which I had the privilege to participate at the workshop on Science and Art, exactly, at her theater, and to see some shows which were present there, and they are in the heart what we are discussing here. This dialogue between culture, but it's not a simple dialogue, it's a dialogue in the name of something, which I called here the sacred. As for the religions, we have to apply this principle of relativity. No one culture constitutes a privileged place from which one can judge other cultures. So the perception of transcultural is first of all an experience, because it concerns the silence of different actualizations. The space between the levels of perception, the levels of reality, is the space of this silence. Is the equivalent in the interior space of that which is called the quantum vacuum in the exterior space. It is a full silence, structured in levels. There are as many levels of silence as there are correlations between levels of perception and levels of reality. And beyond all this level of silence, there is another quality of silence, the place without place, which a French poet and philosopher Michel Camus calls our luminous ignorance. This nucleus of silence appears to us as unknowable. We cannot know it, because it is the well of knowledge. But this unknowable is luminous, because it illuminates the very structure of knowledge. Of course, it's too late now. We cannot do experiences. But let's try to taste a little bit this silence. So let's do not a sophisticated, not an esoteric exercise, a very simple exercise to try to fill this silence we are speaking about. So please sit down, the people who are coming now. And please leave your pencils out. Relax, relax, relax. Close your eyes, please. To keep a little bit inside. Please do it. Do it like I'm saying. Please, all. Because otherwise we cannot work. Now, try now, very quietly, to see where you are, in which place you are. And you'll discover quite soon. Please, Michel Random, leave that out. So try to see where you are. Most of you probably will discover thoughts going on, saying, why hell he's speaking about? I'm not agreeing with what he's saying. What is this transculture, The head will go on, producing thoughts. Don't judge that. Just try now to displace the center from the head to your feelings. Try to see where you are in your feelings. What is this silence in your feelings? Again with the same question. Why I'm here at this session, what I'm listening, what I'm trying to get for me. Very, very slowly. Try now to get in the body. Not in the feelings, not in the thoughts. Just feeling the body. Perhaps the body is tired. Perhaps the body is digesting, satisfied. Don't judge. Now, try not, it's difficult, but try not to put the three together. And just try now, putting the three together, to see where you are on this scheme we already discussed. Where is your place? Okay, we have no time to continue with that, but it's clear that is some information in ourselves which we ignore. The exercise is finished, but we have no time. But it's clear that there is some information inside which is hidden because of the talking all the time inside. So the silence doesn't mean at all not to think, not to know. Silence means what we said just before, a new type of intelligence. Information, real information. Now, I'm saying that because if there is an universal language, which I'm looking for in transdisciplinarity, this universal language will be not put in a dictionary. It's the experience of the totality of our being. So we try to get a taste of what we can call a trans-language. From the physical perspective, human beings are clearly the same. They are constituted by the same matter. Human beings are the same from biological point of view, the same genes and gender, different skin colors, different facial expressions, and so on. Now, transculture suggests, it's a suggestion, it's not a certitude, of course, a suggestion that human beings are also the same from the spiritual point of view. Beyond beyond the enormous differences which exist between various cultures. The transculture is expressed by reading all the levels of silence across a multitude of cultures. The rest is silence, are the last words of Hamlet. Now, so the problem will be to find an organic language which is beyond this infernal chain of abstraction after abstraction, interpretation after interpretation, thought after thought, theory after theory, book after book, and so on and so on. We can spend millions of years going in circles. So, from where can come a spontaneous event of the being? This cannot be of other nature than a sudden nature, because we are accustomed to work on a different level. Now, in other words, that which is found in the center, in my opinion, is an opinion, of transculture, is the problem of time. Time is the measure of change of different processes. Time is always thought of the past and the future. It is the domain of the object. In contrast, time lived in spontaneity of the event of being. The present instant is unthinkable. As Charles Sanders Peirce said, one of the great precursors of transdisciplinarity, observed, the present moment is a point in time in which no thought can occur, no detail can be separated. This doesn't mean irrational. It's there, the present moment, but cannot be thought. So, the present moment is the living time, which concerns the subject, more precisely, concerns the link between the subject and the object. So, the present instant is, strictly speaking, a non-time, which we just try in a very fast manner to have the experience of the third. This means the relation between the subject and the object, which contains and the past and the future. This means the total flow of information, which crosses levels of reality and levels of perception. That's the past and the future in this approach. So, in that sense, the present time is the origin of the future and the origin of the past. So, different cultures, present and future, have extensions in the time of history, which is the time of change in the state of being of nations, of peoples. But the culture concerns the time which is present in transhistory, which is a concept coined by Eliade, introduced by Eliade. In fact, just between parentheses for people here to know that Eliade had to be a founding member of the CIRET, International Center for Transdisciplinary Research. He died just 1 year before the center was founded. So the transculture concerns the time in transhistory, which concerns the unthinkable, the unthought, and the epiphany, in terms of Eliade. So in that sense, the transculture is the spearhead of transdisciplinary culture. Different cultures appear as different facets of the human being. So I'll close with that statement, which must be neutral and obvious in some sense, that the multicultural allows the interpretation of one culture by other culture. Intercultural permits the fertilization of one culture by another culture, and the transcultural assures the translation we come to the problem of translation of one culture into various other cultures by deciphering meaning which links them, and in the same time going beyond them. Thank you. This is just to make a kind of application to the names of the included third, just to put a triangle with A, non-A, and T, with the names which are important for me and for the transdisciplinary approach. I put Einstein as A, which is the really highest level of classical mechanics, classical physics. Max Planck, which is the founder, non-A, the founder of the quantum mechanics, and strangely enough, as a T-state, he's not a physicist, really. He was also a physicist, was a logician called Kurt Gödel. It's just to finish in a lighter note. This figure I bring here, of this ternary figure, I bring just as a curiosity, in some sense, document, because this drawing was made by Lima de Freitas for 94 at our first World Congress of Transdisciplinarity. He tries to make drawings to show how we can represent the included middle. So he produces this nice picture here. Lima de Freitas, you know, was one of the big masters of painting in Portugal and the organizer of the first World Congress in Convento de Rábida in 94, where several of you here were present.
Alguém quer fazer perguntas, comentários?
Perhaps I need some, no? If there are questions in Portuguese, I need for the translation.
Saram, j'aimerais vous remercier très très chaleureusement pour votre brillante conférence. Vous avez dit à un moment donné que la transdisciplinarité n'était pas une science à proprement parler. Est-ce qu'on peut la définir comme une attitude philosophique? Est-ce que c'est possible de parler d'un bouleversement philosophique?
Oui, on peut toujours parler, mais sans épuiser la transdisciplinarité, parce que la philosophie, c'est aussi une discipline bien déterminée. On peut parler d'une attitude philosophique, d'une attitude religieuse, d'une attitude... je veux dire, ça n'épuise pas la transdisciplinarité. Les mots attitude est évidemment très adapté, mais attitude philosophique le diminue en quelque sorte. Le mot attitude est plus riche. Enfin, d'ailleurs, qui a été introduit aussi par un poète, par Roberto Juarez, poète d'Argentine, dans le vocabulaire de la transdisciplinarité. L'attitude, c'est-à-dire l'aptitude de garder une posture. Et donc, évidemment, c'est un bouleversement philosophique, c'est vrai. Parce que si on a dit rupture avec la métaphysique moderne, c'est vrai. Mais en même temps, ce n'est pas une nouvelle philosophie. Ça, c'est difficile à accepter parce qu'on veut toujours s'accrocher à quelque chose qui est déjà connu. Je crois qu'on doit nous habituer d'accepter qu'il peut y avoir quelque chose de nouveau qui échappe à toute classification. Et ça s'appelle la transdisciplinarité.
Mais est-ce que la philosophie à son origine n'était justement pas ce quelque chose qui échappe à toute classification?
Je ne sais pas, je n'étais pas là au moment de la naissance de la philosophie. Et je crois que personne n'était là pour témoigner. Je veux dire, c'est des hypothèses qu'on fait sur la naissance de la philosophie, de la littérature, de la religion. C'est des hypothèses les unes après les autres. Mais ces moments de grâce, de la naissance de la philosophie, de la naissance de l'art, qui peut témoigner sur ça? Peut-être il y a quelqu'un qui peut témoigner,
Oui.
qui est quelqu'un, ce qu'on peut appeler les témoins intérieurs, à nous-mêmes. Il faut les réveiller peut-être. Oui, merci.
Please, I see some connections between your zone of interaction, non-resistance zone, and the entre-deux, the Merleau-Ponty.
Absolutely.
Is it correct, this idea?
Absolutely, yeah. I agree totally, yeah.
Yeah, because...
and it's a concept which was took again in different words by Gilbert Durand, in fact. It's an entre-deux.
okay.
But with the meaning that is a third, which cannot be reduced to the deux. L'entre-deux is not just an absence, it's a presence.
Another question.
C'est pas un creux. Oui.
Another question. I don't know if there is some meaning or not, but if you have levels of a reality and levels of perception, and the lower level of a reality, you don't have the third included.
Right.
Because it's a lower
Sure.
level. I don't know the answer, no. In your model, the fact that the lower level, you don't have the third included, it makes, is there any consequence of this or not?
Of course, is an important point, very important point. Is precisely the point of insertion, I would say in this scheme, of what we call, I try to avoid this word, but you ask, I say it, the secretly included middle is a notion which Michel Camus introduced in our discussions about all that. This means secretly included middle is not a logical included middle. You see, when we speak like that, we can retire perhaps the wrong conclusion that included middle means just logic. It's not true. There are three different included middle. Three. One is logic. The other one is ontologic included middle. What means ontologic included middle? This means crossing levels. Okay. So crossing levels as a third like trace, I was saying, this internal part of the diagram. Now, is a secretary included middle is precisely the point where there are no more logical T, there are no more ontological T, there are no more levels, so must be another third which is acting, which I call that the sacred. Or included, sacred included middle, or the sacred. Yeah.
When you was talking about the levels of a reality, I was thinking about a sort of a generalized Heisenberg principle,
Yes.
like this higher is the level of reality, smaller is the materiality. Smaller
nice.
is the materiality. And so smaller the materiality, higher is the level of perception.
Thank you very much for
So
this remark.
this is I don't know this idea I had.
I never
few
had
moments
this
ago.
idea,
So
and I'm jealous in some sense. I didn't have this idea before, because I like very much what you're saying. Is capturing, you retire in this image just you gave now, I would say a big meaning of all what you're saying here. Thank you.
thank you.
It's absolutely like an indeterminacy principle. You see, okay, because you put the question, let me try to say a little bit more. Let's take the physical principle of indeterminacy, just the physical one, not philosophical, not transdisciplinary and so on. Just the idea, like Nelson said, that if you Heisenberg relations say, for example, that if you try to localize a quantum event in space, the spread in momentum must be higher and higher and higher. If you try to localize an event in time, the spread of the event in energy is wider and wider and wider, going to infinity. So it's exactly what happens in these levels of perception and reality here. But is a difference. I mean, a similarity is a difference. Similarity is that, strangely enough, I can say it now, this description gives a meaning to the principle of that physical principle of indeterminacy. In the sense that gives, I don't say that is a unique explanation, but gives a meaning in the sense that indeterminacy, what we call on our level indeterminacy, comes in fact from the existence of different levels of reality. In other words, is the presence of these levels which induces the probabilistic aspect of quantum mechanics. That's a rational possibility. I don't say that is a demonstration of it, but it's a fascinating possibility. And this idea introduced in 1985, in fact, in my book, Nulla Particulier le Monde. But I say just 3 phrases about that, but here is much more developed. Now, going further is a generalized, exactly what you say, is a generalized quantum indeterminacy at the level of, in the realm of the levels of reality and perception, exactly like you described. And this indeterminacy, generalized, comes from the existence of the sacred, of the secretly included middle. Is a quite fascinating, I think, description of understanding, rational understanding of the meaning of indeterminacy, which in common language we'll call accident, we'll call unknown hazard, or I don't know how. What? Well,
you're saying that there's an objective basis to the uncertainty principle that has nothing to do with the...
Perdão, uma questão de ordem. Vamos agilizar um pouco, cada um